I am recording this confession before my own memories begin to rot away completely. I need to state an absolute biological fact before I explain what is sitting in my living room. I am an only child. My parents had me, and 5 years later they had my younger sister Maya. There is no one else. There has never been an older brother. You need to hold on to that singular fact because I am struggling to keep it anchored in my own fracturing mind. The drive up the mountain pass took 7 agonizing hours. A freak whiteout blizzard had swallowed the interstate completely, dumping thick sheets of heavy wet snow against my cracked windshield. The heater in my rusted sedan died somewhere near the state line. It was blowing nothing but dead freezing air into the dark cabin. The cold left a bitter metallic taste of frost and rotting copper coating the back of my throat. My knuckles throbbed from gripping the steering wheel so tightly. The bald tires slipped blindly over the iced-over roads of rural Oregon. The isolation out there is absolute. If your engine dies on that ridge in December, the cold stops your heart before morning. But I pushed through the exhaustion because I desperately needed the sanctuary of my childhood home. The cabin sat at the very end of a dead-end dirt road, flanked by miles of towering pines that blocked out the sky. When I finally pulled into the unshoveled driveway, the warm orange glow of the porch light felt like a lifeline. I dragged my frozen canvas bag up the wooden front steps. The iced-over planks groaned violently under my heavy boots. I turned the heavy brass knob and pushed the solid oak door open. A rush of blistering heat hit my frozen face like a physical blow. The thick, suffocating smell of burning cedar wood and slow-roasted garlic completely flooded my numb senses. My mother rushed out from the tiled kitchen. She wrapped her arms around my neck in a crushing, familiar hug. She smelled like vanilla extract and stale laundry detergent, exactly like she had for 24 years. My dad was right behind her in the hallway. He stepped forward and clapped a heavy, calloused hand firmly onto my shoulder. Maya bounded down the wooden stairs in her thick wool socks, tackling my waist with a bright laugh. It was completely perfectly normal. Every ounce of creeping paranoia from the isolated drive entirely evaporated. I was home, and I was entirely safe. We moved out of the hallway and into the formal dining room. The antique glass chandelier cast a low, warm amber light over the long oak table. I reached out to pull my usual chair back, but my entire body locked up. My hands hovered motionless over the carved wood. There were 5 porcelain plates set out perfectly on the placemats. 5 tall water glasses, 5 neatly folded linen napkins, 5 sets of heavy silverware. I stared blankly at the empty seat directly across from mine. A sudden, inexplicable drop in the room temperature made my breath visibly plume in the air. The oxygen suddenly grew incredibly thick and heavy in my lungs. My mother wiped her damp hands on her floral apron and casually glanced toward the dark upstairs hallway. She raised her voice, carrying a bright, cheerful tone. "Arthur," she called out, "your older brother is finally home. Come down for dinner?" My stomach dropped so violently I tasted pure acid at the base of my throat. "Arthur, I do not have an older brother." I looked sharply at my dad, waiting for the punchline of some bizarre practical joke. He was just busy pouring dark red wine into a glass, a soft, entirely genuine smile resting on his face. A loud ringing noise started drilling into the very center of my eardrums. Heavy dragging footsteps suddenly began to echo from the second floor. Thud, drag, thud, drag. The old wooden staircase began to groan under an immense, unnatural, localized weight. I could hear the dry, rhythmic scraping of something dragging its mass against the hallway drywall. The dining room chandelier flickered slightly, and then a towering figure stepped out of the shadows. It was impossibly tall. Its pale head nearly grazed the top of the wooden doorframe, forcing it to hunch forward in a broken, sickening posture. It wore a faded flannel shirt that hung loosely over a skeletal, violently angular frame. The limbs were entirely too long. The joints folded at jagged, unnatural angles as it clumsily lowered itself into the chair directly across from me. I completely stopped breathing. The silence in my ears turned into a deafening, high-pitched frequency. Its skin was a glossy, waxy pale, like an old plastic mannequin left out under a blistering heat lamp. The face was a subtle, grotesque mockery of human anatomy. Its eyes were entirely asymmetrical. One sat nearly half an inch higher on the skull than the other, unblinking, glassy, and completely devoid of moisture. The thin lips were pulled tight over a jaw that jutted out just a fraction too far forward. It sat completely unnervingly motionless. There was not a single rise or fall of its chest, no subtle twitch of a facial muscle. A thick, suffocating smell of damp earth and rotting copper began to bleed from its pores. It entirely overpowered the warm scent of the roasted garlic from the kitchen. My mother calmly walked over and casually scooped a massive portion of steaming food onto its porcelain plate. "Eat up, Arthur. You look so incredibly thin," she murmured. She affectionately patted its rigid, freezing shoulder. My dad laughed warmly, raising his wine glass toward the towering thing sitting across the table. "It is so good to finally have all my kids under one roof, a full house." I sat entirely paralyzed. The sharp metallic tang of pure primal dread flooded my mouth. They were not acting. The unconditional love radiating from my parents' faces was genuine, biological, entirely real. Whatever this silent entity was, it had seamlessly hijacked the neurological fabric of my family. I slowly let my eyes track across the oak table. The asymmetrical dead eyes were locked directly onto mine. My sister stood up from her chair, casually grabbing the empty glass water pitcher. "I will go get a refill." Mom, Dad, help me bring in the hot pies. All three of my family members turned and walked away into the kitchen. The swinging wooden door thudded shut behind them. I was left entirely alone in the dim dining room with it. The silence was absolutely suffocating. It was broken only by the muffled howling of the mountain blizzard beating against the frosted glass windows. I pressed my spine hard against my wooden chair. My hands gripped my knees so tightly my fingernails sliced into my own skin. The towering entity did not move its torso. Instead, its pale neck began to slowly rotate. A sickening chorus of dry bones grinding heavily against each other echoed across the silent table. The head twisted to an extreme angle that would easily snap a human spine. It stopped only when its lopsided dead eyes were dead center with my face. The corners of its tight mouth began to slowly peel backward. Its jaw unhinged downward with a wet, fleshy snap. It dropped wide open to reveal rows of flat, grinding, human-like teeth. When it finally spoke, the voice was not its own. It was a stitched-together, static-laced audio recording of my mother and father speaking perfectly in unison. The pitch was deeply warped and delayed by a fraction of a second. "You do not belong here." I did not sleep a single second that night. I sat violently still on the edge of my childhood bed, staring blindly at the locked wooden door until the gray creeping light of dawn finally broke. The mountain blizzard had mutated overnight into a devastating absolute whiteout. Thick, suffocating walls of snow had completely buried the first floor windows under 6 feet of packed ice. The sheer weight of the drifts groaned against the wooden framing of the house, entirely sealing the oak front door shut from the outside. I picked up the heavy plastic receiver of the landline phone resting on my nightstand. I pressed it tightly against my ear and held my breath. There was no dial tone, just a hollow dead clicking sound echoing through the severed copper wires. The massive ancient pine trees outside must have dragged the utility lines down miles away. The realization settled heavily in the base of my throat, leaving the bitter metallic taste of pure adrenaline. We were entirely trapped. There was absolutely nowhere left to run. If I tried to hike out into that storm, my lungs would freeze solid in less than a mile. I knew if I panicked, the towering entity waiting downstairs would immediately recognize the break in my camouflage. I forced my trembling jaw to unclench. I pasted a tight, dead smile onto my face and forced my heavy legs to carry me down the creaking wooden stairs. The rich, overwhelming smell of frying bacon and dark roasted coffee flooded the kitchen. My father was whistling a bright melody over the old cast-iron stove. Maya was casually sorting through a pile of glossy holiday magazines on the linoleum floor, and sitting directly at the center island, hunched over a plate of scrambled eggs, was Arthur. The pale, waxy monstrosity had not changed clothes. It sat incredibly still, its impossibly long, jagged limbs folded tightly against the wooden counter like a crushed spider. I forced myself to pull up a stool directly next to it. The intense, radiating cold pouring off its body felt like standing in front of an open industrial meat freezer. I poured a cup of black coffee, gripping the ceramic mug so tightly my knuckles turned entirely white. I watched it from the very corner of my peripheral vision. The auditory dread of sitting beside it began to slowly rot away my sanity. It was eating, but it was not actually consuming the biological matter my father placed in front of it. It lifted a heavy metal fork and pushed a mass of eggs past its thin, tight lips. Then the horrifying micro-abnormalities began. The entity did not chew, it simply slammed its upper and lower jaw together in a rapid, violent, mechanical rhythm. The hollow, dry sound of flat teeth aggressively striking flat teeth echoed heavily over my father's cheerful whistling. It sounded exactly like heavy river stones being ground into dust. There was no swallowing, no shifting of throat muscles. A thick, heavy lump of completely unchewed food simply slid down its pale, elongated throat with a wet, sickening squelch. Then I stared intensely at its chest, praying for any sign of a human heartbeat. It did not draw breath naturally. Its broad, sunken ribcage remained completely flat and motionless for nearly 3 agonizing minutes. Then, the entire torso violently jerked upward with a sickening wet pop. It inhaled a jagged, rattling gasp of air that sounded like a punctured lung desperately dragging in oxygen. The chest deflated instantly, collapsing inward in an unnatural, broken spasm. No one noticed. My dad casually slid another piece of steaming bacon onto the entity's porcelain plate. "Eat up, Arthur. You need your strength for shoveling the driveway later," my dad said with genuine glowing affection. The psychological torture of sitting in that chair was slowly tearing my mind into pieces. I could not endure the silent, maddening cognitive dissonance for another second. I needed an isolated, controlled environment to break this massive psychological infection. I watched my mother pick up a plastic basket of dirty clothes and walk down the back hallway. I silently slipped off my wooden stool and followed her into the cramped, windowless utility room. I carefully pushed the heavy, solid oak door shut behind us until the brass latch clicked securely into place. The small room was suffocatingly hot and thick with the heavy scent of floral bleach and damp dryer lint. "Mom," I whispered, my voice cracking into a pathetic dry rasp. She gently laid out one of my father's thick flannel shirts and began running a hot iron over the collar. "Mom, you have to listen to me right now." I took a hesitant step forward and grabbed her soft fabric-covered shoulders. I physically forced her to turn around and look at me. "I do not have an older brother." "You only ever had 2 children, me and Maya. The towering thing sitting at the island is not Arthur. There is a parasite sitting in our kitchen and we need to lock ourselves in this room right now." I expected her to look confused or angry or to pull away from me, but she did not do any of those things. The warm, comforting glow in her brown eyes vanished instantly. Every single muscle in her face went completely, undeniably slack. Her features dropped into a vacant, terrifying rigor mortis state. Her jaw hung open slightly, exposing her bottom teeth in a dead, empty expression. Her eyes rolled back just a fraction too far into her skull, leaving a thin crescent of milky white exposed. My breath completely stopped in my lungs. I slowly backed away until my spine hit the cold, vibrating metal of the washing machine. She slowly rotated her body back toward the small wooden ironing board. She reached out with her bare, trembling right hand. She entirely bypassed the insulated, safe plastic handle of the heavy clothing iron. She pressed her bare palm directly flat onto the blazing, hot, searing metal plate. A violent, sharp hiss instantly ripped through the small, locked room. Thick white plumes of acrid smoke violently erupted from beneath her trapped fingers. The sickening, unbearable, absolute stench of bubbling fat and charred human flesh entirely overpowered the smell of floral bleach. The sound of her skin melting was impossibly loud. A wet, violent crackle like raw meat thrown onto a white-hot skillet. She did not flinch. She did not pull her hand away. She did not even blink. She just stood there, letting her own hand violently roast against the burning steel. She slowly rotated her slack, vacant face back toward me, her milky white, blind eyes locked directly onto my terrified face. When she spoke, her voice was entirely devoid of any human emotion. It was a dead, flat robotic drone echoing from the very back of her throat, sounding exactly like a corrupted audio file. "Arthur is our son. Do not threaten him." She held my terrified gaze for 3 agonizing seconds while the yellow fat on her palm continued to violently boil and pop, and then she rapidly blinked. Her eyes rolled forward, and the warm, cheerful maternal smile instantly snapped right back onto her face. She casually pulled her charred, blistered, bleeding hand off the hissing iron. Long, wet, peeling layers of burnt black skin physically stuck to the hot metal plate. She picked up the plastic handle with her ruined fingers and cheerfully resumed ironing my father's shirt. She began softly humming a melodic Christmas carol over the violent pounding of my own heart, while the heavy, dragging, asymmetrical footsteps of my brother slowly stopped on the other side of the laundry room door. The main power grid entirely violently failed just after 4 in the afternoon. The massive, ancient pine trees heavily bowed under the sheer weight of the winter ice, dragging the heavy utility lines down somewhere on the mountain pass. The sudden pitch-black isolation immediately began to physically crush me in the freezing dark. I retreated entirely into my childhood bedroom on the 2nd floor and silently pushed the heavy solid oak door shut. My cold hands were violently shaking as I gripped the icy brass lock to manually turn the deadbolt. The heavy metal mechanism slid into place with a loud, definitive, echoing click. But a simple locked door felt entirely pathetic against the towering waxy anomaly currently pacing the floorboards beneath me. I dropped heavily to my knees in the dark and braced my trembling shoulders against the side of my massive solid oak dresser. I dug my bare heels deeply into the carpet and pushed forward with every single ounce of physical strength I had left in my exhausted body. The thick wooden furniture scraped blindly across the floorboards until it wedged tightly directly under the heavy brass doorknob. I backed away and sat completely rigid on the very edge of my mattress. The psychological toll of total absolute isolation was beginning to severely rot my fragile grip on objective reality. I was trapped inside a freezing sensory deprivation chamber entirely alone with my own suffocating terror. The temperature in the small bedroom rapidly plummeted well below freezing as the mountain blizzard outside heavily intensified. The baseboard heaters clicked and entirely died, leaving behind the bitter metallic taste of frost in the recycled air. Every single ragged exhale I took plumed into a thick white fog that instantly dissipated in the dead still cold. The silence in the locked room was incredibly heavy, oppressive, and undeniably completely unnatural. It was broken only by the deep, resonant, agonizing groaning of the house's ancient wooden skeleton. The violent winter wind relentlessly battered the exterior walls, causing the heavy timber beams to flex and loudly protest. I sat violently still for 3 agonizing hours, just listening to the cold, dry wall slowly settle in the extreme freezing temperatures. My eyelids were impossibly heavy, but sheer biological terror entirely prevented me from sleeping. Then, a totally new sound slowly began to bleed into the dark acoustic environment. It absolutely did not come from outside the frosted window glass. It came from the dark hallway directly on the exact other side of my barricaded wooden door. A soft, wet, dragging noise gently scraped against the hardwood floor. Thick, heavy, and undeniably organic. It sounded exactly like a massive, localized dead weight being meticulously pulled across the rough grain of the wooden floorboards, My panicked heart slammed violently against the inside of my aching ribs. A thick layer of freezing cold sweat suddenly coated the back of my shivering neck. I slowly stood up from the mattress, incredibly careful not to let the ancient metal bed springs loudly squeak. I crept barefoot across the freezing carpet, perfectly masking the dull sound of my own terrified footsteps. I dropped onto my bare, freezing knees directly in front of the blocked entrance. I pressed my chest flat against the heavy, cold oak door and slowly lowered my face down to the vintage brass keyhole. I closed my left eye and peered deeply through the tiny metallic opening into the pitch-black corridor. The long hallway was entirely devoid of any artificial lighting, but my dilated pupils slowly adjusted to the heavy, long shadows cast by the dead moonlight bleeding through a distant frosted window pane. Standing at the absolute furthest end of the narrow corridor was Arthur. The towering entity was facing my door, standing entirely perfectly motionless in the suffocating dark. Its unnaturally long limbs hung limply at its sides, the pale, swollen knuckles nearly dragging directly against the floorboards. Its malformed head was tilted slightly to the left at a broken, sickening, severe angle. I held my breath completely, clamping my own freezing hand tightly over my mouth to manually muffle any sound of my frantic panic. That is when the profound, agonizing auditory dread completely paralyzed my entire nervous system. I realized it was actively camouflage testing its own unnatural respiratory system in the pitch dark. The entity was absolutely breathing, but not in any recognizable normal biological human rhythm. It was flawlessly synchronizing its respiratory cycle exactly with the structural groans of the old dying house. When the violent wind battered the exterior vinyl siding and the wooden beams let out a deep, heavy creak, the towering anomaly would draw in a massive, rattling, jagged breath. It inhaled perfectly in time with the groaning architecture, completely masking the wet, hollow sound of its massive lungs actively expanding. When the heavy wind temporarily died down and the house momentarily settled, it would slowly, gently exhale a long, steady, hissing stream of dead air. The breath blended flawlessly with the ambient sound of the cold draft loudly whistling under the cracked window panes. It was seamlessly integrating itself entirely into the acoustic environment of the second-floor hallway. The sheer clinical predatory intelligence of the mimicry broke something deeply fundamental inside my rational mind. I helplessly watched it quietly, secretly breathe with the house for 10 agonizing, terrifying minutes. I was entirely mesmerized by the profound, sickening horror of its quiet, intelligent environmental adaptation. My frozen leg muscles began to severely, painfully cramp from crouching violently still in the freezing room for so incredibly long. My bare left foot shifted entirely, completely by absolute pure accident. My frozen toe gently bumped against the bottom wooden edge of the heavy oak door frame. It was a tiny, microscopic, dull, hollow thud. It was barely louder than a human whisper, but in the dead, silent, acoustic environment, it echoed exactly like a massive, localized gunshot. The rattling, wheezing breathing at the far end of the hallway instantly, permanently stopped. The towering, waxy silhouette went rigidly, incredibly still in the shadows. Outside the thick glass, the violent howling wind suddenly completely died down into nothing. The heavy groaning timber of the dying house went utterly, undeniably, instantly silent. The entire acoustic environment simply, entirely, completely ceased to exist. My tight lungs began to violently, terribly burn as I absolutely refused to take a single solitary breath. I kept my wide, dilated eye desperately glued directly to the tiny brass keyhole, staring blindly into the silent, pitch-black hallway. The towering silhouette at the far end of the corridor was suddenly entirely, completely gone. It did not walk away, it did not retreat into a bedroom, it simply vanished instantly from the pale moonlight. I blinked frantically, desperately trying to focus my tearing eye entirely through the narrow metal opening. The absolute total darkness immediately inside the tiny keyhole suddenly shifted. A wet, sickening, cold, organic squelch pressed directly against the exact other side of the thin brass plate. A massive gray, unblinking, asymmetrical eye perfectly filled the tiny metal opening, looking directly perfectly back into mine. The terrifying entity was standing less than a single inch away from my terrified human face. It had crossed 40 entire feet of wooden hallway in absolute, unexplainable, impossible, terrifying silence. I fell violently, aggressively backward onto the freezing carpet, scrambling rapidly away from the door exactly like a cornered, terrified wild animal. The heavy brass doorknob began to slowly, violently, aggressively twist. The metal latch groaned heavily, incredibly, against the internal locking mechanism of my deadbolt. The massive oak dresser loudly, violently splintered under an immense, terrifying, invisible, localized weight. And then, a dead chorus of 3 distinct, perfectly familiar human voices cleanly whispered perfectly through the thin cracks in the door frame. It was my mother, my father, and my little sister Maya. Their 3 voices were layered perfectly identically over one another, speaking in absolute synchronized, robotic, unnatural unison. There is only room for one son, let him in. Day 3 in that suffocating house completely eroded whatever fragile grip I still had on objective reality. Sleep had become a physical and biological impossibility. Every single time my exhausted eyelids began to slide shut, the heavy rattling wheeze of that towering anomaly echoed from the downstairs floorboards. The prolonged extreme sleep deprivation was slowly, systematically rotting away the core of my rational mind. When the people you have loved your entire life look you dead in the eyes and tell you the sky is red, your damaged brain eventually stops searching for blue. The relentless, profound gaslighting was actively, successfully infecting my own human memories. I caught myself staring blankly at the frosted bathroom mirror that morning, silently mouthing my own name just to ensure I still physically existed. I needed absolute, undeniable, concrete physical proof of my own human past. I desperately needed an objective, tangible anchor to prove my sanity was still intact before the psychological infection erased me entirely. The old heavy leather family photo albums were stored away in the cramped, uninsulated attic. I waited until the dead, suffocating silence of the late afternoon settled heavily over the freezing first floor. I quietly pushed the splintered remains of the heavy oak dresser away from my bedroom door. I crept barefoot down the dark, freezing hallway, my shallow, jagged breaths pluming heavily into the dead, stagnant air. The temperature inside the house had plummeted so low that a thin layer of frost was actively forming on the interior drywall. I peered silently over the wooden banister into the dim living room below. My mother, my father, and Maya were sitting perfectly, rigidly together on the floral couch. They were entirely unnervingly silent. They were just mindlessly, blindly staring directly at the dead black reflection of the completely unplugged television screen. A small battery-powered emergency radio on the coffee table hissed a constant droning loop of dead white static, and the towering waxy anomaly they called Arthur was nowhere to be seen in the dim, fading gray light. I pulled my freezing gaze away and looked up at the ceiling panel at the very end of the second-floor hallway. I reached up with a violently shaking hand and grabbed the frayed nylon pull cords. I pulled downward, wincing intensely as the rusted metal springs let out a heavy, agonizing, metallic screech. The sound echoed loudly over the dead static downstairs, but the 3 hijacked figures on the couch did not move a single microscopic inch. I climbed up the unstable wooden ladder into the absolute freezing pitch, black cavity of the roof. The thick, suffocating smell of exposed pink fiberglass insulation and dry, rotting cardboard instantly flooded my cold lungs. The attic was a massive, unfinished space, entirely devoid of any natural light. I turned on a small, heavy, metallic flashlight I had pulled from my nightstand drawer. The weak yellow beam cut through the heavy, suspended dust particles violently dancing in the freezing, stagnant air. I dropped heavily onto my bare knees and crawled across the rough, splintering wooden floorboards. My frozen, numb fingers desperately tore through towering stacks of heavy cardboard storage bins. I dug deeply through old winter coats and moth-bitten sweaters until my hands finally brushed against thick, cracked leather. I dragged 3 massive albums out into the open and spread them entirely flat on the dusty floorboards. I clicked the flashlight beam directly onto the very first page of the oldest book. It was a wide, glossy photograph of my parents standing on a bright, sunny beach in Southern California. Maya was building a small sandcastle in the foreground, and I was standing right next to her. I let out a ragged, desperate sigh of pure, massive biological relief, but then my dilated pupils slowly drifted entirely toward the background of the printed image. Standing waist deep in the distant crashing ocean water, towering horribly over the other blurred beachgoers, was Arthur. The waxy, malformed entity was standing entirely perfectly still in the rolling summer waves. Its impossible jagged limbs were dangling uselessly in the salt water. Its asymmetrical, unblinking dead eyes were staring completely through the glossy paper directly into the camera lens. My lungs violently seized in my freezing chest. The metallic taste of pure panic flooded the back of my dry throat. I frantically, aggressively flipped to the next heavy plastic sleeve. It was a photograph of my 10th birthday party in our old cramped apartment. I was blowing out small candles on a chocolate cake, and towering directly in the dark, narrow kitchen doorway behind me was the pale, waxy, smiling face. It was retroactively, aggressively rewriting physical history. It was not just hijacking the fragile neurological pathways of my sleeping family. It was deeply, permanently infecting the actual physical reality of the past. I leaned entirely, completely close to the birthday photograph. The dark, heavy ink rendering the entity's face was physically, undeniably wet. The black chemicals were actively, slowly shifting and bleeding across the glossy paper right in front of my face. The anomaly was utilizing the hijacked memories of my parents to retroactively construct an absolute perfect physical alibi for its camouflage. My entire biological past was being aggressively, actively, permanently deleted from the physical world. I frantically flipped the heavy pages until I reached the very back of the leather album. There was a single thick Polaroid tucked entirely alone in the final plastic sleeve. The white border was completely, permanently stamped with a date from just 2 agonizing days ago. It was an image of my family sitting happily around the warm, crackling fireplace. My mother, my father, Maya, and Arthur were all smiling warmly, brightly, happily into the flash. But I was absolutely, undeniably, completely missing from the photograph. In the exact physical spot where I had been kneeling next to Maya, there was absolutely nothing but a deep, violently dark, black static like blurred smudge. It looked exactly like a thick, deep, empty void bleeding aggressively into the physical chemical paper. I was the one being systematically, completely, violently erased from the physical human world. I stared blindly at my own erased physical reality as the ringing in my ears reached a deafening pitch. A sudden, deafening, violent, heavy crack echoed exactly right outside the slanted roof. A massive, ancient, frozen pine branch completely snapped under the heavy ice, and violently smashed aggressively directly onto the roof shingles above my head. The sudden, absolute, localized impact completely shattered the fragile bulb inside my heavy metal flashlight. I was instantly, violently plunged back into absolute, suffocating, heavy, pitch-black darkness. The deafening sound of the storm outside was suddenly, completely, entirely cut off. Then, the heavy wooden trapdoor leading back down to the second-floor hallway aggressively, violently slammed perfectly shut with a deafening, echoing bang. The loud, distinctive, heavy click of a metal sliding padlock snapping firmly, permanently shut echoed from the outside. I was entirely, permanently, completely trapped in the pitch-black, freezing crawl space. The absolute total darkness was completely suffocatingly heavy and completely unnaturally thick. I froze entirely, completely on my bare bleeding knees. And then, 10 feet away, directly in the absolute black center of the freezing attic, a heavy, wet, dragging organic footstep slowly, deliberately scraped against the rough, splintering wooden floorboards. Thud, drag, thud, drag. The massive, agonizing, localized weight slowly, purposefully walked exactly toward my trembling spine. A freezing damp breath heavily brushed exactly against the sensitive skin of my exposed neck, and a deeply warped, distorted, hissing metallic whisper echoed perfectly cleanly in the absolute dead dark. Camouflage failing, I did not wait in the pitch-black freezing attic to be systematically erased. A raw primal survival instinct entirely bypassed my failing rational mind. I threw my freezing weight violently against the slatted wooden vent set into the cramped crawl space. The brittle frozen wood splintered and completely gave way under the massive physical impact. I pushed my torn, bleeding shoulders through the narrow opening and threw myself blindly out into the raging whiteout. I plummeted 12 feet directly down into a massive, heavy snowdrift banked against the dark back patio. I clawed my way out of the crushing ice, dragging my numb, shivering body across the buried wooden deck. The thick glass of the sliding kitchen door had shattered inward from the intense pressure of the howling storm. I pulled my freezing, bleeding body over the jagged, broken frame and collapsed onto the cold kitchen linoleum. The entire interior of the house was submerged in a heavy, suffocating, pitch-black silence. I slowly pulled my violently shaking body up against the freezing granite countertop. My bare, torn feet left dark, wet smears of pure red across the pale ceramic tile. I reached blindly into the heavy wooden butcher block, resting silently next to the cold stove. My trembling fingers wrapped tightly around the thick, textured rubber handle of my father's forged steel carving knife. I began an agonizingly slow and perfectly silent stalk through the pitch-black house. The absolute deafening silence was broken only by chaotic flashes of blue lightning tearing across the mountain ridge. I slipped perfectly silently under the wide wooden archway and entered the freezing open living room. A sudden, brilliant, jagged flash of atmospheric lightning entirely illuminated the room for a fraction of a single terrifying second. Standing motionless directly in front of the dead brick fireplace was the towering, waxy anomaly. It was completely cornered. There was absolutely nowhere left for it to safely hide or retreat in the pitch dark. I slowly, purposefully raised the heavy, thick blade perfectly level with its pale, elongated throat. But before my tight vocal cords could produce a single human sound, the towering, waxy entity entirely collapsed. It dropped heavily onto its pale, shaking hands and protruding bony knees. It threw its unnaturally long, jagged arms violently over its pale, malformed head in a completely defensive posture. Its entire skeletal body began to heave with massive, gasping, desperate human sobs. Massive, wet, heavy, entirely real tears of unquestionable biological terror were streaming down its pale, waxy face. "Please," it screamed. Its voice was cracking in a raw, undisguised, agonizing, absolute human panic. "Mom, Dad, please wake up and help me. It is going to absolutely kill me. I played along perfectly all week. Please, I just quietly, desperately wanted to survive." The heavy forged steel knife hovered entirely frozen in the stagnant, dark, freezing air. The cowering, weeping figure trembling on the wooden floor threw a shaking finger toward the wall directly behind me. It was desperately pointing at the heavy, dusty antique mirror permanently mounted above the oak console table. A massive, violent web of brilliant blue lightning fractured across the pitch-black sky outside the window. The blinding white electrical light intensely illuminated the heavy, thick glass of the dusty mirror for one single solitary second. I slowly turned my heavy neck and stared directly into the reflective, freezing glass. The physical, biological thing standing where I was standing was an impossibly tall, waxy, grotesque monstrosity. One unblinking gray iris sat nearly half an inch higher on the skull than the other. My heavy hands, still tightly gripping the bleeding kitchen knife, were pale, swollen, and violently elongated with massive, jagged knuckles. My incredibly long jaw hung open at a sickening, unnatural, severe angle, exposing dense rows of flat, grinding needle-like teeth. The suffocating, thick, rotting smell of damp earth and rotting copper was pouring directly from my own pale, waxy pores. The fragile, fabricated human consciousness inside my desperate mind instantly shattered like cheap, brittle glass. I am the apex psychological mimic. The warm, nostalgic memories, the unconditional, desperate love for my parents, the safe, comforting warmth of the fireplace. It was all just stolen, rotting, artificial neurological data. I had systematically downloaded it directly from the sleeping minds of the human family to flawlessly complete my biological camouflage. The weeping, terrified, sobbing entity violently huddled on the freezing wooden floorboards was the entirely real, authentic human son. His biological name was Arthur. He had spent the entire agonizing week silently enduring the absolute waking psychological nightmare of my sheer physical presence. He had perfectly masked his absolute terror while I systematically hypnotized his own parents into violently defending my own impossible existence. The horrifying micro-abnormalities I actively witnessed all week were nothing but a deeply traumatized human boy quietly hyperventilating in isolated freezing panic. My internal panicked human monologue suddenly warped and aggressively distorted into a cold, guttural, entirely deep alien frequency. The pathetic, warm, desperate human fear I had been blindly experiencing was instantly, permanently deleted from my biological neural network. I slowly, gracefully let the heavy forged steel knife slip completely from my pale, swollen, incredibly elongated fingers. The heavy metal blade clattered heavily and uselessly onto the wooden floorboards. I stared completely dead down at the weeping, pathetic, terrified, fragile human boy cowering perfectly in the absolute dark. The corners of my tight, pale, waxy, incredibly thin lips began to slowly peel far backward. My massive, jagged jaw violently unhinged completely downward with a wet, perfectly echoing, fleshy snap. I smiled my entire multi-road, flat, perfectly heavy, grinding, beautiful smile into the absolute, dead, dark, dusty glass. I lifted my massive, pale, organic foot and took one single, agonizing, heavy step forward to permanently eliminate the absolutely only human anomaly left inside my entirely new house. The deafening, violent sound of the howling mountain blizzard completely swallowed his absolute, final, desperate human scream.